How's it going, everybody? Jesse Mails here from Backwater Fly Fishing, coming at you with this episode of Tailgate Talks with Loon Outdoors. Now today's super cool. We're going to be talking about a subject that I'm super passionate about, something that I've done for a long time, and that's tarpon fishing, but particularly how to gear up and prepare yourself, your gear, your mind for your first tarpon trip if you're not really sure what you're getting into. So we're going to clarify a lot of things about tarpon fishing, what makes it so awesome, and what you need to do to get ready. One of the first things is having a good rod, okay? A lot different than trout fishing. The tarpon, you're gonna want a fast action rod for most every scenario. And depending on the size of the fish, you're gonna be looking at a 6 weight all the way up to a 12 weight. And tarpon are all over the place, right? African continent, North, South America, Central America. You're gonna find tarpon in a lot of different situations. Finding out the destination that you're gonna be fishing them is very important on how we prepare our gear. The size of the fish can be 15 pounds to 150 pounds. So you have a big spectrum of what you're gonna be doing. That's gonna change flies, it's gonna change line, reels, everything all the way to the rod. And depending on where you are, you're gonna be using small flies like this. Now I'm a fly guy, tie a ton of flies, and tarpon really aren't that picky. Typical patterns like tarpon toads, the black death, small minnow patterns if you're fishing smaller fish, gurglers if you're fishing smaller fish. In most cases, your bigger fish are gonna look for, your black death, your tarpon toads, EP bait fish. Things like that are going to get their attention, and making sure the fly isn't super heavy. A lot of times, and most of the time when the fish are in shallow water, you don't want sort of like a clouser minnow jigging action unless you're in channels or deeper flats. So having a fly that's going to be in the column and stay there the longest is super important. Typically the tarpon's going to feed upward, okay? So you want that fly almost always to be above that fish. So if the fish are 5 feet below the surface, you're going to want your fly to be coming in that 3 foot range, that 2 foot range, and have him feed upward on it. The main thing you want to find out is what they're going to be feeding on. And they feed on anything from little shrimp and crabs to insects in places, all the way up to 5-pound mullet. So you have a big range again of what the food source is going to be. I would recommend, if you're going tarpon fishing for the first time, be sure to try and get a guide in that area that knows what the fish are going to be doing at that particular time. That's going to help you know what flies you're going to throw. Now you could be throwing really small flies like this or even smaller. Or if you're down here in Costa Rica where I am right now, we fish really big flies like this one tied by my good friend Mariano. And it all depends on what those fish are keyed in on. For rods, I fish a Walton rod solely. I've also fished the Sage salt rods. Those are super good rods. And I've fished the Reddington Predator on tarpon for a long time. All those rods are great rods that typically, aside from the salt, won't break the bank and will get you started. For reels, you're going to want something with a good drag system and something that could hold a lot of backing. If you're fishing big fish, you're gonna need 250 to 300 yards of backing. If you want to put gel spun on it and get a little more length out of that, you can. But typically, if you're on a skiff, you're gonna be able to chase that fish down, and that's gonna work for your benefit. For reels, drag's super important. Sage reels, Hatch reels, Nautilus. All these companies now are making very, very good products. So you can get into these reels and sort of be confident that your drag's not going to burn up the first time you hook a giant tarpon. As far as lines, that changes with situations too, right? We're going to find tarpon in rivers. We're going to find tarpon in lakes, lagoons, beaches, on the flats, shallow flats, deep flats. You name it, you could find a tarpon there. So line is also something that's very particular to the place you're fishing. If I'm fishing the flats and the keys, chances are I'm using a floating line. Deeper flats, maybe I have an intermediate line. If I'm down here in Costa Rica, we're throwing intermediate to full sinking to even lead core to get these big flies down into the zone. So talking with your guide and finding out, are we fishing channels? Are we going casting mangrove shorelines? Are things that you're gonna need to know before you go. And that ties in obviously with the flies, the weight of the rods, and all kind of hanging on the size of the fish and the conditions you're gonna be pursuing them in. Line, super important. Now, you can use pre-made leaders. I've used pre-made leaders from Rio and from Cortland Line for a long time. And I personally haven't had problems with their pre-tied leaders ever, really. The main thing that you're gonna wanna look at is if you're gonna be needing a shock tippet, and also if the pound test of your bite tippet. So tarpon have really hard mouths, right? So you can't go in there fishing 20-pound test and think you're gonna walk away with a big fish. It's not gonna happen. So having plenty of leader line ranging from 20 all the way up to 100 is gonna help you, especially if you're tying your own leaders and you're going butt section to mid section and a bite tippet. You're gonna need those different types of line while you're tying those. Now down here, we almost always fish 100-pound bite tippets. We have dirty water and we are throwing big flies. The fish really aren't leader shy. If you're in really clear water situations like in Florida or Bahamas or Mexico in some places, you're gonna find those fish are gonna be scared of that 120-pound leader in some situations. So you gotta downsize. 60 pounds, 80 pounds for sure if you're fishing bigger fish. There's no way, you know, if you're fishing fish over 60 pounds, you know, that 40-pound leaders a lot of times won't cut it depending on where the fish is hooked. So keep that in mind. Line's very important. When you're carrying those type of line, you're gonna need something to cut it with. Don't forget your pliers, don't forget your snips. You know, biting through 80-pound is not fun. I know a lot of us have done it, and it's not worth doing for a long period of time. So make sure you have something to cut that line with. A big thing about tarpon, you're gonna see the eat in most situations unless you're in murky water. That fish is gonna roll on the fly. A lot of people have a tendency to strip right away, or God forbid you trout set. In tarpon fishing, there's no trout setting. So if you're coming from up north, you have a trout background, you gotta practice your strip strikes. Super, super important. You cannot hook a tarpon effectively by raising your rod like this. If you're going into tarpon country, typically it's hot, okay? Sun protective gear always, sunscreen if you got it, and being ready to be out there sweating until you see some fish, especially if you're just standing on a bow in Florida somewhere waiting for groups of tarpon to come. You know, be ready for that mentally, physically. Big tarpon are a whole nother animal. If you're gonna hook up on a fish and fight it for an hour, you need to be ready for that physically. And casting in the wind, another physical preparation that you need to be able to do. Practice your double hauls. In most situations, that single haul 30-40 foot cast isn't gonna cut it, especially if it's windy. Being able to cast into the wind, crosswind, and something that people kind of overlook a lot of times is being able to, if the wind's blowing in a certain way, be able to make a backhanded cast with a double haul and get that line to shoot where you need it. Anytime you're tarpon fishing, whatever can go wrong is gonna go wrong. You're gonna have to have that in your mind. You're gonna break rods, you're gonna break lines, you're gonna break hooks. You're gonna hook the guide with your cast. If it's windy, you're gonna do all these things, and that's okay. But being prepared with the right gear, like we talked about, and being prepared physically to make those casts in those demanding situations are gonna make you a lot more successful when you go try tarpon fishing. So keep that in mind, guys. This was another Tailgate Talk here at Loon, and thank you guys for listening. Deuces.